11 months ago, I started my rent to temporary accommodation journey. I didn't start with a lot of money at all, and I got into rent to temporary accommodation. Well, fast forward to today, I now manage and control over 20 properties within the rent to temporary accommodation space. That makes me £12,200 profit per month. Now, it didn't always start like that. I started with a strategy called rent to service accommodation, which is a strategy where you take on properties from landlords and then you put it on platforms such as Airbnb, Booking.com on a night-by-night basis. You charge your guests a nightly fee, and then you make the difference. So whatever the landlord's rent is, you take it on a night-by-night basis, or you put it on these platforms on a night-by-night basis, and then you make whatever the difference is that is basically yours. Obviously, again, you have to minus the rent, the bills, the cleaning costs, etc. So that is a strategy that I originally started with within Airbnb. Now, one thing I realized within the Airbnb or within the rent-to-rent space is there is actually a lot of information online about Airbnb. However, when it comes to social housing, in particularly temporary accommodation, there's little to no information online. So it's very hard for people that are out there to know who is the best person for them to listen to. So within this video, what I'm actually typically going to do is I'm actually going to break down, or we're going to talk about, number one, my journey from Airbnb into basically the High Performance Academy. From the High Performance Academy, then the transition from Airbnb into temporary accommodation. Yeah, we're also going to talk about the mentorship program. So the transition from Airbnb into the High Performance Academy. And we're actually going to break down, what does a deal look like, an Airbnb deal and a temporary accommodation deal? And what does that look like in London? From my experience, Airbnb is very volatile, where, again, with some properties I have, which I have one property on an Airbnb and I've given back some units just due to performance. Now, Airbnb can be very volatile in terms of, yes, 1 month you could be making £2,000 profit per month. The next month you could actually even break even. Another month you could actually be a negative. Airbnb doesn't necessarily give you the stability that you need to plan and to actually say, okay, cool, this is how much I'm going to make to the T next month. Whereas when you do social housing, it gives you that stability in a sense where it actually allows you to calculate how much money you're going to make to the T, no questions asked. And that's the stability that I kind of longed for. And hence why the transition kind of came from Airbnb into temporary accommodation. So what initially attracted me into Airbnb as my entry point was, I'll be honest, I had a cousin that I wanted to get into property with. I still have a cousin, but I wanted to get into property with him. And obviously at the time, he wasn't actually ready to get into property. But as you can imagine, you can't wait for anyone in this game. So he actually pointed me in the right direction to a mentor. And he said, you know what, one of his friends are on that mentorship. And he was like to me, look, he's seen success in it. He was like, join it. So for me, when someone when someone I know vouches for like a product or service, that's kind of enough for me to be like, you know what, I actually trust it and I'm willing to take the risk. So based on that vouch was the reason why I then said, okay, cool, let me approach this mentor and go on to it. And I'm not going to lie, I did pray about it. That was one of the most important things that led me to actually joining that mentorship. So when I joined the mentorship, obviously, again, it was a good mentorship. It taught you everything that you needed to know about Airbnb, how it ran, how to analyze numbers, how to find the good landlords, how to speak to landlords. It was a very, very good mentorship. I will never knock it. However, my experience within Airbnb was quite early on. I kind of understood that it is very expensive to, when you don't have a lot of money and you're trying to get into that strategy, it's very expensive to start up. If I was to start again in my property journey, I wouldn't do anything differently per se. I would definitely get into property much more earlier than I did. However, getting into Airbnb was probably the best thing that happened because it taught me like all the stresses that come with Airbnb. It taught me how to actually analyze numbers. It taught me the day-to-day process and what it actually looks like to run a service accommodation and what actually goes behind it. And once I was doing Airbnb, it showed me the level of stress that it actually comes with. And again, everyone talks about passive income, but when you do Airbnb, and a lot of Airbnb operators know this, it's not necessarily passive as people like to think. I wouldn't necessarily do anything differently. I would have just got into property earlier. When I was doing Airbnb, I started doing Airbnb. Within 4 months into mentorship, I actually secured my first Airbnb property. It was a really good property. It was a no money down deal. And I'll be honest, I was really making about £100 in between because what I done was the numbers on that property, it didn't actually stack. So what I did was I gave it to a bigger company than myself, which are what you call a back-to-back lease. So I gave it to a big company myself, and I only made £100 profit by putting the money down into that deal. So it taught me a lot, because with Airbnb, you can't just take on any property in any area. You need to ensure that the numbers and the data behind that property, it all aligns and it all stacks. Because if you take on property that you haven't crunched the numbers or done your due diligence to it, you typically will end up paying out your own pocket. And because it was my first property, I'll be honest, I wasn't willing to take the risk on it once I crunched the numbers and analyzed stuff in that area. So fast forward, once I took on my first Airbnb property, it was about, I think it was actually about 10 days later, the same landlord gave me another unit in Canary Wharf. Now, I took that property on a joint venture, and I realized that on that property, because this was a property that I actually took on first month rent, plus the furnishing costs, plus actually physically doing the work. So it was a unit that I was fully taking on myself, again, with another company. It's just to diversify my risk, because I wasn't fully confident in the strategy. Now, again, as we started doing rent to service accommodation, it went really well. For the first month, we were booked up 100%. And this was like in the August, September period. First 2-3 months, we were actually booked up 100% occupied. We had 3 guests staying all long term. And I was like, yeah, Airbnb is it. This is what I want to do. I then quickly started to realize that, as you can imagine, the low periods or the slow periods is from December, I would say probably from January to February. So I started to realize quite quickly that Airbnb wasn't necessarily giving me that stable income. I couldn't confidently say, oh, this is how much I'm going to make next month, no questions asked. And I didn't like that. On top of that, you had the stress of, obviously, you are starting off by yourself, and you're not going to outsource a lot of the work you do, because again, to keep costs low. So you are having to do the guest inquiries. You're having to look at your prices constantly. You're having to ensure that your guest in your property is always looked after, and just ensure that anything they want, they kind of get, because you need to satisfy that guest to the highest level, because their review determines your occupancy a lot of the times. A bad review, as you can imagine, Airbnb is probably the worst thing ever. So yeah, I quickly started to realize that Airbnb was you could say it was very volatile, and I didn't like that. So come February 2025, I started my property journey into my transition into temporary accommodation. Now, I actually lived in temporary accommodation, so I always knew that temporary accommodation was a thing, and I was always curious about how I was living in temporary accommodation, but how did the council get this property? And I was always kind of curious on that fact. So within the December period where the Airbnb was going all right, I started looking into different strategies or other strategies, such as temporary accommodation. Now, as I was looking into this temporary accommodation strategy, I was kind of just understanding, just based on my own experience. I was speaking with my mum that, like, how did this actually work in terms of, we were given a property by the council, but where did that property come from, etc. I was just trying to understand it fully. Again, doing your research online. But one thing I came to realize once I started doing my research is that you don't see a lot of information. So when it comes to Airbnb, you see a lot of information online. You can actually start your Airbnb business from just the information you gather online, because there is a lot of information on Airbnb online. But one thing I realized about temporary accommodation is there's little to no information about temporary accommodation online. And that's one thing, as I started doing my research, is that I started to realize that if this is a strategy I want to get into, I need to be with people that actually are doing the strategy fully. So that's when I kind of started doing my research. And again, because I've seen a little bit of success in investing in my own education, I started looking at different people that were in the social housing space, that do temporary accommodation or that do social housing in general. And I actually came across Louise Newton and Sean Davis. So again, I'll be real, I didn't just jump straight into it. I did heavy due diligence. I was looking at their Instagram pages. I was looking at their YouTube videos. I was just trying to look at what they were talking about and kind of backdate it. And what I realized is they were at the time 2 of the biggest people that were doing social housing within the space and actively talking about it and documenting the journey. I also realized that when you want to do social housing, it is, so again, I compare it to Airbnb a lot, because with Airbnb, if you mess up, that's the results or the consequences will be put on yourself. I.e., if your contract isn't airtight with the landlord and something happens, maybe you might have to pay rent out of your own pocket. So you lose money. The impact is on yourself. When you do social housing, if you mess up when you do social housing, you're not just impacting yourself financially, potentially, but you're also impacting another family, meaning you're taking that family or you're putting that family into a worse position. So I realized that in doing temporary accommodation, because I know the impact it had on me, I realized that doing temporary accommodation, I need to know what I'm doing, not guess, not say this is what I think I need to do, but actually say this is what I know I need to do. And hence why it kind of prompted me to, again, further look into my education in terms of the social housing space, and then actually prompted me to join the High Performance Academy. That's kind of where I kind of started looking to transition into temporary accommodation. When I joined the High Performance Academy, like, I'll be entirely honest, I'm not a person that likes to guess what I'm doing. I like to know what I'm doing. I'd rather someone tell me that this is what you need to do, and I go out to do it, and then I know how to do it. I don't want to do trial and error, because trial and error, believe you me, is expensive. I'm not about that. I'll be entirely honest. So in joining the High Performance Academy, it was quite literally, I was being told what to do in terms of this is what you need to do in order to secure units. Now, Sean had over 90 rent-to-rent temporary accommodation units. So it was a man that knew what he was doing from A to Z. Ed Hughes as well, he was a mentor within the academy at the time as well. He had over like 25 units at the time I joined. He's got over 40 now, but he had over 25 units at the time I joined. So again, that was someone that was actively doing something that I wanted to get into. And then Luigi Newton as well, he had 30 properties at the time I joined, a £7.1 million portfolio, consisting of social housing units and, again, working professionals, HMOs. I knew I was in a group of people that knew what they were doing, and again, a lot of them documented their journey, so the proof was obviously, the social proof was there. So yeah, and transitioning into it, it was a case where everything was there in one place. They kind of told me what to do. They gave me all the resources, contracts, how to speak to landlords, the scripts you need. But most importantly, it was understanding the process of temporary accommodation and what rights you have as a business. How does you entering temporary accommodation protect you? And it was understanding the business side of temporary accommodation, because as you can imagine, everything's a business. The council is a business. So it was basically joining on the academy, going through the content and actually learning, okay, cool, this is what I need to do. This is step by step and what I needed to do. Now, you can imagine, obviously, from coming from an Airbnb mentorship, I was already confident that, look, I don't doubt my own ability because it's been proven, it's proof of concept. But for people out there that don't actually have proof of concept, how do you have that confidence to join a mentorship and say, this is what I'm going to do? And this is, I'm actually going to kill it? Well, I'll be honest, it starts with you. Are you the type of person to do something to it, or are you the type of person to say to yourself that, look, no matter what, I am going to kill it in this. I'm going to ensure that the money I'm investing in my own education, I'm going to ensure that I'm going to make that money back through doing what I'm doing. So you have to be honest with yourself. Like, what type of person are you? So yeah, I was honest with myself, and I just knew that, look, I'm going to make sure it happens. Like, I'm going to ensure that I kill it within the rented temporary accommodation space. So as I said, again, everything I needed was all in one place. So it was basically left for me to kind of go out with all the information I've had, all the knowledge that was given to me, and go out and just literally start implementing the steps that they gave me. So again, once I joined the High Performance Academy, it blew up my growth. I'll be entirely honest. I went from securing 2 units in the space of in the space of 11 days, obviously. So I secured 1 Airbnb unit, and then the same landlord gave me another unit. But then I went quiet for about 6 months. So I went from no properties for 6 months to then getting my first temporary accommodation property in like March 2025. That's when I got my first temporary accommodation property. And then from that to obviously now, over 20 properties throughout the academy. So as I was in the academy, I love giving back to people in terms of like just what I do. I actually got offered the opportunity to, first I was obviously a community manager, where I was actually just managing the community, like a lot of questions people had. But again, as I said, I wanted to do more from the community. I always wanted to give back. And yeah, obviously as a result, and due to obviously the results showing up and just being a trustworthy person within the academy, I got actually made a mentor from that academy. So now I actually teach the exact same strategy that has allowed me to scale to where I am today. So again, if you guys are interested, there is a link in my bio that I'll leave there. Obviously, in becoming a mentor, I'll be entirely honest, it allowed me to, it gave me a lot of fulfillment as well, because at the end of the day, I'm one person. I can't house everyone's homeless within the UK. However, what I understand is that I can teach people how to do temporary accommodation right, do temporary accommodation well, and then go out to implement it. Basically further my impact that I'm making. So not just within my business, but in other people's business that are doing the right thing within temporary accommodation, because I personally know the impact that temporary accommodation has on you when you do it right. Temporary accommodation is done correctly. If temporary accommodation is done with care and consideration, you can actually you impact families' life point blank. And because I understood that, being a mentor and teaching people how to do that was something that like just sat dear to me. So yeah, being a mentor definitely did shape the way I started thinking. So the core differences between Airbnb and temporary accommodation is one strategy, which is Airbnb. That's obviously, there is no guarantee that you're going to get paid that certain amount of money so for example, a guest could book your property and they could cancel. So then that could affect your bottom line for that month. So there is no guarantee in terms of the income. And you have to ask yourself this question. If you do a property strategy, you want to ensure that it is recession proof. But ask yourself this question, that if COVID was to hit again, or if a pandemic was to hit, would your property strategy survive? And again, that was heavily a thought that was going through my head, and temporary accommodation started ringing bells, because when COVID happened, everyone that had temporary accommodation units still had the same amount of units they had. In a global pandemic or global recession, they still made the same amount of income. Their income wasn't affected. So I always look at it like, what is the difference? One is volatile money in terms of it's not guaranteed. One's guaranteed by the government. Cost of living crisis, pandemics, it doesn't necessarily affect that strategy, because again, it's government-backed money, and the government quite literally print the money you spend. So let's actually break down the costs of starting off an Airbnb, the cost of actually starting off a temporary accommodation unit. And what we're going to do is we're going to break down worst case scenario, because again, you have to be conservative when you're crunching your numbers. So we're going to look at all of that, and we're going to actually figure out, okay, cool, what strategy has a low startup cost, again, doesn't cost much to maintain and run, and again, there is scope for it to be long term, because in business you always look for the long term. You always look for longevity in a business. So for example, let's do it like this. Average price of a 2-bed property in the UK, let's say for example, is £2,000, both for an Airbnb unit and a temporary accommodation, both £2,000. So you have £2,000. Now, let's say with an Airbnb, so let's start with Airbnb. With Airbnb, you have £2,000. Now, again, if you want to take on the property from a landlord, typically you need to pay 1 month rent at £2,000. You then need to pay a deposit at a further £2,000. You then need to furnish the property, so fully furnish the property. And we are going on the assumption that the property is empty. So you then need to fully furnish the property. So that could cost you anywhere between £5,000 to £7,000. Now remember, I said we're being conservative. So let's say it was at the high end figure. So that's £7,000. So you've got £2,000 rent, you've got £2,000 deposit, you've got a £7,000 furnishing fee. So the total in that is going to cost you around £11,000 to get started with your Airbnb unit. Mind you haven't had key bookies. Now let's look at temporary accommodation. So you now have £2,000 in rent. Let's say you have to pay a deposit as well, so you have a further £2,000. Now some councils, you have to lightly furnish the property. It all depends on the council's demands and needs. So let's say worst case scenario, as I said, always look at worst case scenario. We have to be conservative with the numbers. Worst case scenario, it costs, again, you have to lightly furnish the property. So again, beds, wardrobes. But let's say that costs a further £2,000 to put beds in the property and wardrobes, a normal 2-bed property. That's being very conservative. So now you're £6,000 into a temporary accommodation grant compared to £11,000 in for a Airbnb unit. Now, again, let's look at this for example. So when you go Airbnb, you can charge whatever you want per night. Now, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that your property is going to be occupied. There's a lot of factors that come in getting the property occupied. What are your competitors saying? How many reviews you have? How many listings are in that particular area? Is there demand in that area? There is a load of factors that actually have to be factored in for you to charge a nightly rate. So typically you can charge whatever you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean your property is going to be booked. So you're £11,000 in for Airbnb, and you are £6,000 in for a temporary accommodation unit. You can actually see like the startup costs for an Airbnb unit just to get it up and running is more expensive than it is to get a temporary accommodation running. Now, again, if you're starting off new and you don't have a team in place, you then need to also factor in you're going to be running everything by yourself. Now, when it comes to temporary accommodation, Once a family goes into the property, quite literally, it's probably a text on WhatsApp if anything goes wrong, and they let you know when you send out the right person. With Airbnb, you obviously have to ensure that you're actively checking in on that guest, ensuring that they're good, ensuring that the property is obviously all good to standard, all up to standard, because again, they're only staying there for a short time, refreshing towels, etc. The day-to-day running on an Airbnb unit is significantly more than a temporary accommodation, 100%. And I say that not being biased or anything, but I say that from actually doing Airbnb, doing temporary accommodation. And I say that because I say that from that standpoint. So again, you have to look at what strategy. And as I said, when it comes to running a temporary accommodation unit, it is far less stressful because again, you're ultimately dealing with that one family that is in that property, that's going to be in that property for a long period of time. With Airbnb, you're dealing with high turnover. So you're dealing with a guest that might stay there for one night, a guest that might stay there for 3 nights. So there is a lot of variable cost when it comes to Airbnb. So again, income doesn't come as predictable as temporary accommodation. So again, you need to look at this as a start cost. And again, profit margins on, again, depending on how you stack both deals, can quite often be the same. So you're looking at a strategy that you have to obviously heavily nurture, heavily have systems in place, heavily even have virtual assistants and people in place to run smoothly. Once you get to a certain level, you're looking at a strategy where you don't necessarily have to have the most amount of systems in place for it to run very, very smoothly. So again, I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think that temporary accommodation is more worth it? Do you think it's more Airbnb? But as I said, let me know in the comments. Guys, if you do like this type of content, I am going to be posting more and more on YouTube. Do drop me a follow on all platforms. And again, subscribe because it does good for the algorithm, guys. Subscribe, like, share, do all that jazz. Appreciate you guys.